in a different location today. I'm Joseph. This is Input English. Let me turn around and give you a glimpse of the place we're visiting. I think you can see it right there. That is the USS Hornet CV-12. This great ship is 820 feet long at the waterline, but it's 75 feet longer overall because the front and the back of the ship are actually longer than the ship is at the waterline. It was built in the early 40s. I believe it was launched in about 1943, and it participated in a very big way in the Second World War. It was decommissioned after the war, only a few years after the war, but then it was recommissioned again for use, and it was used off the coast of Vietnam. It was also used to recover space capsules. Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 coming back from the moon splashed down in the ocean, and those capsules and the astronauts needed to be recovered, and this ship did that task. When the crew from Apollo 11 returned from space, from the moon, there was a concern that they might bring with them some sort of contaminant, some sort of germ that we on Earth had never seen, and so they were quickly placed in a quarantine capsule that was actually made from an Airstream trailer. They used the hull of a travel trailer to house these astronauts returning from the moon. I traveled about 50 miles to get here. The ship was decommissioned and was brought here to become a museum. It's been here for many years. One of the things that people familiar with YouTube would be aware of is the need for a content creator to have a plan for reasonable operational security. We're all aware of the need for security of our personal information online. When you post personal information online, it could be used for harmful things. Those of us who create content and post it online need to have a plan in place for our operational security. As you watch videos on the Input English channel, you see that I disclose some things about myself and my past, but other things I keep confidential. When I came here, I realized that it was probably time to disclose a little bit of information that I had previously not disclosed. The reason for that is a great sense of nostalgia on my part when I arrived here. I had been thinking about this, knowing that I was going to come here, but now arriving here and seeing what I'm seeing, I'm confident that I need to tell you a little bit more about my past. I have been here before. I've never been on this ship when it was an active aircraft carrier, I can tell you that. I have visited it once when it was a museum. But the time before that I came to this location, it was very different because this was the Alameda Naval Air Station. This was an active Navy base, and I came here for official business. The reason I had to come here is because I was a Navy officer. I was an officer in the U.S. Navy, and at that time I was not on active duty, I was a drilling reservist. This was when we lived in Sacramento, and my Navy career on active duty was before I met my wife. So she was completely unfamiliar with that part of my life working as a Navy officer. As a drilling reservist, I would go to the reserve center on the weekends and do my duty there. But as a drilling reservist, I wasn't deployed anywhere. We didn't get sent to foreign locations. We could have. It just didn't happen. While I was a drilling reservist, I got promoted from lieutenant commander to full commander. And this was a milestone that I really enjoyed. It's hard to put into words my thoughts on this topic. In general, I am not impressed with rank, status, money, power. No, these things are fleeting and to me mostly unimportant. So I never really worried about what rank I was. I just did my job. But there was something peculiar about making full commander. It caught my attention. It made me smile. So when I got the notice that I was a commander in the Navy, not a lieutenant commander, I needed to get my ID card updated. My ID card reflected lieutenant commander, and I was supposed to get it updated. Well, in Sacramento, California, there was no place that issued official ID cards. So I found the nearest facility that could do this function, and it was here. So when we had some time, I came over here with my wife. We drove over from Sacramento to this location, but this was an active duty Navy base. We pulled up to the guard shack, and you had to show a reason to come onto the base. The general public was not permitted to come onto the base. It was people who should be there, not people who wanted to be there. So when we pulled up to the guard shack, I knew that I needed to present the piece of paper that showed that I had a reason to be there. It was the document that showed my new rank and that I was directed to get a new ID card. The person at the guard shack was a soldier in the Marine Corps. Her duty that day was to guard that entrance into this base. So as I pulled the car up, she raised her hand indicating that I needed to stop, which I did. I rolled down the window and handed her the piece of paper so that she could read my reason for coming onto the base. She read the paper and then got a very serious look on her face. She handed the paper back to me very crisply, and then she stepped back one step, came to attention, and then saluted me. And as she released the salute, she said, "Commander." Well, I was a little embarrassed. I wasn't asking for any recognition. I was there just doing a task. But I did have to smile. It was a nice honor. It was very pleasant. And she was doing her job. The funny part of that exchange was what was happening with my wife, because she was completely unfamiliar with the armed forces. She has had no dealings with the armed forces, and so when she saw this Marine Corps soldier snap to attention and salute her husband, saying "Commander," she didn't know what to think. She thought that was totally crazy. For years after that, if we ever had any heated discussion and she wanted to make a point, she would stand up stiffly, salute me, and say, "Commander." And of course, by doing that, she was mocking me, but in good humor. We actually get along really well. And so that was actually very much an icebreaker because it injected humor into the discussion. So that's the background. Right here is a ship's anchor. I presume it's from this ship. I haven't studied it to give you that detail, but it is the proper size and the location. So I presume it's from this ship or a similar ship. So I'm going to go to the entry and pay the fee to get in, and then we will walk up the brow. When you enter a Navy ship, you go up a ramp. Well, assuming you walk onto the ship. You could land on an aircraft carrier and not have to walk at all. You just land an airplane on it. But if you walk onto a Navy ship, you go up a ramp called the brow. So I'm going to pay the entrance fee, and then we'll walk up the brow, and then we can see what we can find of interest on this retired Navy ship. So with that discussion and that disclosure that I was a naval officer, you might wonder, was I ever at sea? Did I ever go onto a ship? And the answer was yes. I was deployed on a ship. It was a relatively short tour. I was temporarily assigned as part of the ship's company, but it was not an aircraft carrier. It was a submarine tender. The ship upon which I was assigned has subsequently been decommissioned and scrapped, so it no longer exists. But I did have a brief tour of sea duty. So then you might ask, okay, so you didn't spend much time at sea, but you were a Navy officer for a number of years, so what did you do? And the answer was, I was a research scientist. So I've disclosed that in the past, but the laboratory in which I worked as a scientist was owned and operated by the U.S. Navy. So this is the entrance. I'm going to go up these stairs and cross the brow. If I was coming here as an officer on active duty being assigned to this ship, there is a protocol when arriving here. You're typically greeted by a guard at the end of the brow, and you may have to present credentials to that person, but typically the proper etiquette is you say, permission to come aboard, and then they, based on their records, would say, permission granted. Then you enter, but as you enter onto the ship, you turn to the stern, that is to the back of the ship, and you salute the flag at the fantail. The fantail is the back of the ship. And when I was on the submarine tender, when I was on active duty, I entered the ship by that method. Permission to come aboard, presented my credentials. They saw that I had the right paperwork. I had orders to be on the ship. They handed the orders back to me, said permission granted. I saluted the fantail and then came on board. Here you can see some lines, cables. There are things that moor this ship in this location, and you can see those structures on the lines. They look like lampshades, and those are to prevent animals from climbing up onto the ship. Those are to protect the ship from rats, for instance, that might try to come aboard. You see those on lines of big ships. We're now on the ship. We're one deck below the hangar deck. I came down here looking for a bathroom, and I found it. One of the things I noticed when I came aboard is that it smells just right. It smells like a Navy ship, and I feel like I've been here before. It just smells normal. Of course, there are not nearly as many people on board as there would be if this was an active ship. It's now a museum and there are very few people aboard. So I'm going to walk in this direction because I was given directions that if I go aft, that is toward the stern of the ship, I will find the sick bay. So this is the wardroom pantry. So this is the officers' mess. This is where food is prepared for the officers who are assigned to this ship. This space is not labeled, but its proximity to the officers' mess suggests that perhaps it is the wardroom. This is a ready room. This is where the aviators would come and be addressed, given their assignment, given a briefing on what their mission would be. So Navy aviators would have occupied these chairs, and the briefing would have been given from this lectern here. This thing is called a lectern. Some people call that a podium, but the podium is something upon which you would stand. The lectern is something like this against which you might lean, something that might hold your notes or a book or something like that. This is a lectern. This is crew's quarters. This is berthing for the enlisted people who were assigned to the ship. They sleep in bunks. This is called a bunk. But actually, in the Navy, they don't tend to call them bunks. They usually call them racks. When a sailor is going to get some rest, get some overnight sleep, they climb into their rack. They're lockers for people to keep their belongings. A ship of this size would have many hundreds of people on board, and they would need a place to stay. This is an operating room. This is part of the medical facility on this ship, and you can see an operating table, IV stands, all the equipment that might have been used to do emergency surgery, emergency procedures. So this is part of sick bay. This is an operating room. This is a laboratory used to support the medical officers on this ship. They could do blood counts and simple chemistries to help take care of the patients that need their care. This room is for the developing of x-rays. They have an x-ray machine, perhaps more than one, and this was back in the era that x-rays were made on film, and so this is a setup for developing x-ray film. This office would be used by the medical officers. This is their office space. This is another procedure room, and here's the x-ray machine. So we had our tour of sick bay. Now it's time to go up this ladder. Now most of you all would call this a stairway, but in the Navy this is called a ladder. And I'm going up the ladder. So we're now back on the hangar deck. During World War II, this would have been full of aircraft. They had several different kinds of combat aircraft that they used during that era. So this would have been a very busy place, and then these aircraft stored on this hangar deck would be brought up to the flight deck on an elevator, but it's no ordinary elevator. It's a very big industrial elevator that can lift huge amounts of weight and take an entire aircraft from this level up to the flight deck. So if you look up here, you see the top of this hangar space. There's a ceiling here, and you might construe that the flight deck is right above that. Well, it is, but I am told that at least in some areas, there is a space between the flight deck and the hangar, and that crew berthing was placed in those locations. I'm not sure that we'll be able to see that, but it's something I read when I did my research for this visit. So after World War II, the aircraft carrier was temporarily decommissioned, and then it was recommissioned, and it saw duty off of Vietnam. After that, it participated in the recovery of two Apollo crews, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Now, this is an Apollo space capsule, but it's not one that took men into space or to the moon. This is a true capsule, but it was used in a developmental role, and it did fly into space, but not with men on board. It did its job. Behind me, it looks like there's a travel trailer. This is an Airstream. It was a coach made by the Airstream company, but it was rebuilt to Navy specifications or NASA specifications to isolate the crews returning from space because of the fear that they would bring some sort of pathogen to Earth, something that we were ill prepared to handle and cause big problems. So the crews, which were recovered by this ship, Apollo 11 and 12, when they came aboard, were quickly put into a container like this, an isolation facility on board. So you might ask, so is this the original one that was used for the astronauts for Apollo 11 and 12? And the answer is no. And then you might think, well, then it's just a mock-up, right? It's just a fake display, right? No, this is the real deal, and it was slated to be used to recover the crew from Apollo 13. But if you recall, Apollo 13 never landed on the moon because they had an in-flight emergency, and they came back having never set foot on the moon. So they didn't need to be isolated. So this is a real crew isolation facility made by Airstream, modified by NASA, but it's not the one used for Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. So far, I have not encountered any World War II era aircraft. This is an S-2 tracker, which, as I recall, had anti-submarine duties. This aircraft behind me is a TBM, and these were assigned to this ship during World War II. This is a Crusader, a supersonic fighter, and it was much after the fact compared to the World War II era. So this is the flight deck. Behind me there is this building, this superstructure, which is referred to as the island. As we head toward the aft of the ship, you can see the flag on the fantail. That's the flag that someone coming aboard would salute as they come aboard. You can see on the horizon, across the bay, is San Francisco. Now you can get a better look at the island. That would be where the bridge is and probably the Combat Control Center, radio operations, etc. This airplane is a trainer. Although they were used in combat, they were refitted for a counterinsurgency role, and they were very effective. This is called a T-28. It has a very large, powerful radial engine, a huge propeller, but it had tricycle gear, so it was much easier to land. If you look under the fuselage, there is a surface that has a bunch of holes in it, and that is a dive brake. That is a surface that can be deployed by the pilot if he or she is diving and doesn't want to pick up too much speed. It's like putting on the brakes. That's why they call it a dive brake. This type of aircraft did not exist at the time of World War II. So we're now forward on the flight deck. Behind me is an A-4. This is an attack aircraft, Vietnam era. And they have it positioned at this end of the catapult. This ship was equipped with steam catapults so that an aircraft could be positioned here, and when it was time to launch, they would take their engines to full throttle, release the brakes, and then the steam catapult would throw the airplane into the air, blast it off the end of the flight deck, and by the time it got to the end of the deck, it was traveling at flight speed. The A-4 participated in combat in Vietnam, and it comes to mind in a personal way because a friend of mine was an A-4 pilot in the Vietnam era. He was also a naval officer, but he was a flight officer during the Vietnam era. I knew him later. He flew an A-4, but he was shot down over North Vietnam and spent a number of years as a prisoner of war. He came back and resumed his Navy career. But I remember very well that he flew an A-4. I'm now walking along the path of the steam catapult. So I've concluded my visit to the museum, the USS Hornet. I walked back to the stern of the ship, the aft end of the ship, and you can see this is the stern. It was an interesting visit. This museum is open to the public, and it has a lot of history to be seen right here. The thing I enjoyed the most was talking to the docents. Many of the docents are former Navy personnel who do this as a sense of duty. This was a very positive visit for me. So I invite comments below, and if you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.